The year is 1187. The desert burns under the noon sun. Two armies stand face to face, one bearing the cross, the other the crescent. And in the middle of that shimmering heat rides a man the Crusaders called the Devil of the Desert, but his people called him something far greater. Saladin, the Lion of the East. The story of Saladin doesn't begin with war. It begins with humility. Born in Tikrit, the same night his family was exiled, Saladin grew up far from royalty. He wasn't the son of a king or a conqueror. He was the son of a soldier and a dreamer. As a young man, he served quietly under the great general Nur ad-Din of Syria, a man who fought not for glory, but for God. While others trained with swords, Saladin studied history, philosophy, and the Quran. He was gentle, kind, too kind, they said, to rule, but destiny doesn't need permission. When Nur ad-Din died, the Muslim world fell into chaos. The Crusader states, those small Christian kingdoms carved out of the Holy Land after the First Crusade, had grown arrogant. From their castles in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli, they raided Muslim villages, burned caravans, and enslaved pilgrims. They believed the East was theirs forever. But a storm was coming. Saladin began uniting the fractured Muslim world, Egypt, Syria, and beyond, under one banner, one purpose. Not for conquest, but for liberation. He didn't call it jihad in the sense of blood and terror, but a struggle of the soul to reclaim what was sacred. By 1186, the world had changed. Saladin's empire stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, and in the west, word spread that the Saracen king was preparing for war. The Crusaders laughed. They saw him as a monk in armor, a scholar playing soldier. They were about to learn how wrong they were. It all began with a spark of arrogance. A Crusader lord named Reynold of Chatillon broke the truce. He attacked a Muslim caravan, merchants, women, even pilgrims on their way to Mecca. When Saladin demanded justice, Reynold mocked him. "Tell your prophet to save them." Saladin's calm broke. He swore before God, "I will kill Reynold with my own hands," and that oath would set the world ablaze. The Crusaders rallied under King Guy of Jerusalem, gathering their knights and banners. Saladin's forces, tens of thousands of soldiers, archers, and cavalry, met them near a hill called Hattin. The air shimmered with heat, the grass was dry as parchment, and Saladin controlled the water. He surrounded the Crusaders, cutting off every spring, every source of life. For 2 days they baked under the sun, their throats cracking, armor scalding. By the third morning, many had gone mad from thirst. Saladin ordered drums to thunder across the hills, hundreds beating in unison. The desert roared like Judgment Day. Then his archers moved. A storm of arrows darkened the sky. The Crusaders, desperate, charged forward, heavy knights sinking into sand, blinded by smoke and heat. The Muslims circled them like wolves. It wasn't a battle. It was an annihilation. By dusk, the cross fell. King Guy was captured, and Reynold of Chatillon, the man who mocked the prophet, was brought before Saladin himself. The Sultan offered him water. Reynold drank. Then Saladin turned to King Guy. "You did not ask my permission to give him drink. My promise was only to you." He drew his sword and struck Reynold down. Justice, swift and merciless. The world trembled. Jerusalem, the heart of the Crusades, lay defenseless. In September 1187, Saladin's banners appeared outside its walls. Inside, panic spread. The defenders remembered what the Crusaders had done 88 years earlier. Rivers of blood, churches burning, streets full of corpses. They expected revenge. But Saladin was no butcher. When the city finally surrendered, there was no massacre, no looting, no desecration. He ordered his soldiers, no killing, no looting, no desecration. He walked through the gates of Jerusalem not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. The crescent rose above the city once more. The muezzin called the prayer from the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the first time in nearly a century. And instead of blood, there was peace. Even the Christian chroniclers wrote with awe, "The mercy of Saladin was greater than the cruelty of our own." But mercy has a price, and in Europe, that price was outrage. When the news reached the West that Jerusalem had fallen, churches filled with weeping crowds, kings trembled, and one cry echoed through Christendom: "Take up the cross once more." The Third Crusade was born. Led by the mightiest kings of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. The age of emperors had returned, and Saladin would face his greatest challenge. But before the storm arrived, the Sultan's world began to crumble from within. He was exhausted, his hair turning gray, his body weary. He had conquered half the known world, yet still slept on a mat, still gave away his gold to the poor. When asked why, he said, "What I hold in this world is nothing. What I give is eternal." He ruled not through fear, but through character. Even his enemies admired him. Chroniclers in the West wrote of his chivalry, his compassion, his unwavering faith. One knight said, "If a man could be both Christian and Muslim, he would be Saladin." Then came Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king of England. Fierce, brilliant, and reckless, arrived in the Holy Land in 1191. His armies clashed with Saladin's across the coast, Acre, Arsuf, Jaffa, a brutal dance of victory and loss. At Arsuf, Richard led a perfect counterattack, breaking Saladin's cavalry with iron discipline. But unlike most conquerors, he didn't chase a total victory. He wanted Jerusalem, not endless blood. So did Saladin. Both men were tired of war, bound by respect. After years of battle, they agreed to peace. Christians would keep the coastal cities, Muslim rule would remain over Jerusalem, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter freely, unarmed, unharmed. The war that began in fire ended in honor. When the treaty was signed, Richard sent word to Saladin, "If I must lose my kingdom, may it be to a man like you." And Saladin replied, "There is no king in the world I would rather see beside me than you." 2 enemies, 2 lions, 2 men who found humanity amid holy war. In March 1193, just 6 years after retaking Jerusalem, Saladin fell ill. The conqueror of empires had nothing left. When he died, his treasurers found barely enough coins to pay for his burial. The man who ruled from Egypt to Syria died poorer than the beggars he fed. But his legacy, his mercy, his honor, his faith lived on. The Crusaders called him a legend. The Muslims called him a hero. History calls him something greater, the proof that greatness isn't in conquest, but in character. Jerusalem had changed hands. Empires had risen and fallen, but the fire of the Crusades still burned. Because where Saladin's mercy brought peace, others saw opportunity, gold, power, indulgence. Soon the West would march again, but this time not for God, but for greed. The Holy War was about to turn on itself. They had sworn to free the Holy Land. Instead, they would destroy their own. The next crusade would not fight Muslims, but it would burn Christians. Stay tuned for Part 3, The Crusade That Betrayed God, the Fall of Constantinople.